What we're covering in this topic is Millennium Development Goal number 3, which is to promote gender equality and empower women. This is an interesting one for a number of reasons. Number one, when we look at the target, which we're going to do in a minute, there's actually two targets, one of which was for 2005. And as you'll see as we look at some of the examples later, some aspects of that were met by 2005. However, when we start to look at the indicators, those are definitely more long-term. The other important thing about this particular goal is that the hard indicators that we're talking about in many places are improving while the actual spirit of the goal is going backward. In other words, in many countries in Eastern Europe, even as universal secondary education for both boys and girls is nearing, the social attitudes toward women, what they can do, stereotypes, and especially the resulting powerlessness that's leading to trafficking of so many women from this part of the world is just appalling. So as we look through this, I want you to keep these two things in mind. Some of the indicators at first will start to make you feel like, wow, this is doing well. But then, as you review a special chapter in this book on human trafficking, because you need to understand what lack of women empowerment in treating women as if they're objects rather than human beings, where that leads. And so the social mores, the need to teach respect, the need for human rights for both males and females is more important now than ever, even though some of these specific targets and indicators would make you think things are getting better. Looking back at the indicators for monitoring the Millennium Development Goals, which we looked at earlier, that booklet that had all those indicators in it, well, the goal is promote gender equality and empower women. The target is to eliminate gender disparity in primary and secondary education, preferably by 2005, and in all levels of education no later than 2015. And then there are 4 indicators, which are also sort of interesting, given that we're just talking about primary and secondary education. The indicators, or movement towards this goal at any rate, is ratio of girls to boys in primary, secondary, and tertiary education, the ratio of literate women to men 15 to 24 years old, the share of women in wage employment in the non-agricultural sector, and the proportion of seats held by women in national parliament. So if you think about the goal is to make sure everybody gets equal access to education through the secondary level, one of the indicators of whether that is really happening is then are women able to take a place within the power structure of the society. So that's what we're going to be looking at. First, as we've been doing, I'm going to have you read the next 2 chapters in Investing and Development. We're continuing to move through this report, and now we're getting more practical stuff. I hope you find this as interesting as I have right along. And this week's 2 chapters are chapters 6 and 7. Chapter 6 is key elements for rapid scale-up. The point of this is, okay, people are thinking this can't be done. Well, how can it be done? Well, it can be done if you take these steps quickly. And these things will allow you to scale up. You need adequate investment, you need certain processes in place, and all that's part of the reading in Chapter 6. Chapter 7 then begins, and we'll see this more next week too, but begins then to look at specific types of institutions that need to be involved and that need to scale up in order for the Millennium Development Goals to be reached by 2015. And what we're going to look at this time is governance. It talks about how important good government is, how important it is that the government can act as an arbiter within the society to make sure that resources are used appropriately between the government, nonprofit, non-governmental organizations, and the private sector in general. So then we'll be looking at other institutions as we move forward. After we do that, the next section that we'll be dealing with is the background of Goal 3. As usual, we're going to begin building the background by looking at the United Nations Goal 3 overview. This is the overview done by the statistical section that we've been looking at. And you begin to see what the quantifiable data looks like in education, employment, political decision making, going back to those indicators that we talked about a few minutes ago. Another thing I put up for you to read is the UNDP report on taking gender equality seriously, making progress and meeting new challenges. This is a very short report. It's 16 pages. It's interesting because it's a good combination of, okay, this is what's happening, this is some of the facts behind it, and here's some anecdotes. So it's a very readable 16-page report. In fact, for those of you that might be doing something with your classes, this would be a good thing that I think as you read through it, you'll realize that you could print this out, 16 color pages, not a big deal. So it's a very usable resource, I think, going forward. There's also a couple resources from UNICEF I'm going to have you take a look at. The Goal 3 overview, which shows what they've been doing and how what they do, working with children to try to promote gender equality and that mindset in children, how that then goes on to help future generations. Another report I'd like you to read, though, is the UNICEF report titled Women and Children, the Double Dividend of Gender Equality. Looks big when you open it. There's only about 89 pages, and once again, there's a lot of charts and things in there. But I think that this is important because this shows why, as you start to read some of these reports, like the UN, the statistical report, you'll see right at the beginning, they say that the gender equality issue really underlies all of the other Millennial Development Goals. And one of the reasons that's true is because the resources available to the women with children are available to the children. In just about every society, and this is especially true of developing and transitional economies, the women are the main caregivers for the children. And so the resources they have, the children have access to. Resources they don't have, the children don't have access to. And then for background, we're going to continue using the Oxfam materials, the Goal 3 poster, the Goal 3 activities. This might be interesting for those of you who use these activities with your students. You might find some interesting discussions here as far as how the young ladies in your class might view some of these issues versus the young men. One of the things we need to remember is that in the United States, when we tend to think of gender equality, we think of it more in terms of stereotyping, either the idea of, okay, are you a doctor, are you, or a nurse. Doctor's nurse is one of those examples. So you tend to think of doctors as men, or at least when I was growing up, that was the way it was. Maybe not so much anymore. But those sort of gender stereotypes. The other thing that we think of is equal pay for equal work. Okay, and those are two big issues, not saying they're not important, but that's not the same as, say, a family being able to sell their 13-year-old daughter to a neighboring family for a cow so that a 45-year-old guy can have a 13-year-old girl as a wife. That's a little different aspect of control of your life and who you are. The fact that in some societies, even today, and you'll see some statistics in one of these readings, and I don't even remember which one right now, but because in certain cultures, and I think China and India are mentioned, males are more valued as members of society than females are. Female babies are more frequently aborted, or once they're born, aren't taken care of as well. They're not given as much food as the boy babies would be, and so tend to die at a younger age. So when your students start to see these things, and what we're talking about in terms of gender issues, that it's not just what you can do for a job, although that's important, but it's whether you get to live or not, based on whether you happen to be conceived as a boy or a girl, I think you'll have some interesting discussions in your classes around those issues. Then we'll look to Eastern Europe and how Goal 3 and the gender issue is playing out in Eastern Europe. As I said earlier, one of the interesting things is that Eastern Europe, under the Soviets, tended to have more gender equality, both in terms of the societal mindsets, but certainly in terms of job availability, in terms of education. And you'll see some of the statistics in here shows that some of that is starting to go backwards, especially in terms of education. If somebody needs to stay on the farm and work, it tends to be the girls and not the boys. So they're falling behind in some basic ways. And yet, as you'll see in the Progress and Prospects in Europe and Central Asia report that we've been going through under Section 3, it states in that report that women face growing inequality in violence, human trafficking, and poor access to reproductive health care. As I said at the beginning, some of the statistics look good. When you start to see how socially things are playing out, women are going backwards. You see the same sort of observations in the two examples we're going to use this week. One, we used both of these actually last week as well, the Millennium Development Goals in Georgia and the Moldova's National Report. Both of these reports discuss these same issues. And lastly, I want to focus specifically on the trafficking issue. The trafficking issue was a big deal in Ukraine. The trafficking issue in Moldova is huge. The number of girls that are being exploited and exported as virtual slaves in the sex trade and in other industries is just appalling. Things are so bad in the villages here. Anything to get out seems better than what they have until they get there and then wish they could come back and it's too late. So I put in the last chapter in here, specifically on human trafficking, a report published by UNDP, but if you look at it, you'll see that UNICEF was involved, several United Nations agencies were involved. It's called Trafficking in Human Beings in Southeastern Europe. This is a 350-page report. I'd love to see you read the whole thing, but I'm not going to ask you to do that for this topic. I would like you to read the executive summary and chapters 1 and 2 of the report. That will give you a good feel for how things are. The rest of the stuff are details that you might or might not be interested in. I've put a site having to do with human trafficking, and at that site, there's specifically resources for teachers, which you might find interesting if you look around. And then I put links to two stories, one from BBC and one from Radio Free Europe, and both of them are specifically on trafficking in Moldova. So as you can see, this is a pretty intense topic. And I hope you feel that as you go through these readings. And then I hope you take the time to go to the forums and discuss some of these issues with us. By the way, the picture you've been looking at is a group of students that I worked with in western Ukraine at Uzhgorod State University from 2000 to 2004. I still keep in touch with some of these students. But you can see here, even in the university setting, the young men and the young women tend to group together with the young men in front. I just thought this was an interesting picture.